Hi, it's Dr. Steve, and welcome to our online learning class. Today, let's consider the student-centered method of cooperative learning. Cooperative learning simply means that students are working together in a small, usually a mixed ability learning team, and in that team they are addressing specific instructional tasks. The teacher presents the group with a problem or a task, something to solve, something to work on, and then the students work together to determine the solution. There are a lot of great dynamics that happen in cooperative learning. For example, students help one another, they praise each other, they sometimes criticize, they're critical on the contributions that each other makes, and students in many cases will receive a grade for the group, so the group itself gets a grade. The benefits of cooperative learning have been found to be both academic and also on student attitudes. So academically, participating in cooperative learning typically leads students to higher academic achievement compared to if they are working individually. And in terms of student attitudes, it tends to improve interpersonal relationships, tends to improve the student's attitude toward the subject, the content area, and it typically improves the overall feelings for students on their whole classroom experience. Remember that we had considered the learning pyramid. In a typical traditional classroom setting, teachers are utilizing lecture, reading, and also some type of audio-visual presentation. So if we look at that, the average retaining of the content is normally about 5%, 10%, and 20% respectively for those three methodologies that a teacher could use in his or her classroom. Now, when we consider if we're doing cooperative learning, a discussion group situation, the average learning retention rate jumps up to 50%. And then if we have students in a cooperative learning situation mentoring or teaching each other, the average learning goes up to about 90%. That's why cooperative learning works. Cooperative learning has been found to be more effective if the teacher carefully chooses who's in the groups of students and utilizes a heterogeneous as opposed to a homogeneous grouping of students. So by homogeneous, we would mean people who are of the same ability type. So for example, if you have all low ability students in the same group, that's a homogeneous grouping of students, and typically those students, their performance will worsen by participating in the cooperative learning groups. Now, on the other hand, if the teacher selects carefully and mixes up the skill levels, the experience levels, the perspective, the attitudes toward the subject matter, toward the content, and mixes that and creates a diversity in the groups, that tends to work very, very positively, and it positively affects student achievement and a whole lot better than when students are just working as individuals. We can organize cooperative learning into two different types: learning in pairs or dyads, or learning in small groups, also known as cooperative learning groups. Let's now take a look at each type of cooperative learning situation. One example of cooperative learning that can take place with two students or a dyad is known as peer-assisted learning. Now, we know peer-assisted learning as peer mentoring or tutoring. In a tutoring situation, you pair one student who is more skilled in the subject matter with another student who is less skilled in that subject matter. The benefits from tutoring involve, first of all, it's active learning. So both students are participating actively in the learning, and typically both students realize an increase in their academic achievement. So it's a very effective form of teaching. Think back to the learning pyramid. It said that in discussion groups, 50% of the material considered is retained, but if somebody teaches someone else, 90% is retained. Another way of using cooperative learning with groups of two is to use paired team learning. In paired team learning, students study and they learn in teams of two. This works very well for gifted students. Specific uses of this include, again, depending on your content area, if you can utilize this, if you wanted to have students drill and practice certain content. If they were going to work on a book report, they could mentor each other. You could assign homework partners. And also, in doing some type of a project, you could assign pairs to work on that project rather than to assign a project per individual person. One of the most popular or most widely used ways of using cooperative learning with groups of two in dyads is think, pair, share, and has proven to be a very effective method of using cooperative learning. To use think, pair, share, there are 3 steps in it. First of all, the teacher poses a question or a problem or some information to be considered, and then provides a little wait time for the students to think. It's important to allow a few minutes for students to think quietly before you pair them up. So after the think period, then comes the pair time. And in that case, the 2 partners will work together, compare their responses. And if you've allowed enough time in the think stage, now they'll have something to discuss together. And when they pair, they compare and they identify which is the best response, which again might not be either of theirs, but maybe it's a new response that comes from a discussion of or merging of the 2 responses. And finally, after they think and they pair, now it's time to share the results in some fashion. So you can either have all of the pairs, you could have a few pairs, you could have just pairs that want to volunteer. If you're using one-to-one education, you could have the pairs use some tool like Padlet and or some other similar tool, and they could share their results through technology. But think, pair, share is one of the again very popular ways of using cooperative learning, and teachers use it in a variety of ways. So, for example, not only at the end of a lecture time, but sometimes right in the middle of a lecture, the teacher can pause and say, okay, here's a point, I've just covered something, now let's do a think, pair, share, and provide a very specific aspect of that content just covered for the students to consider. So as a future teacher, consider how could you use think, pair, share with your content area in your classes. Let's consider an example of how think, pair, share could be used in your classroom. In our classroom, we were considering the learning pyramid. We were looking at ways in which students learn. So, for example, we looked at brain research, we looked at constructivism, Bloom's taxonomy, among other things. Having lectured and having considered some of these things, then I would say, okay, we're going to have a moment to think, pair, share. And I would pose a question. So my question will be, why is student-centered learning more effective than traditional direct instruction or lecture? So we have a lecture, we would pause, I would pose the question, and then I would allow a minute or two for everybody to think, because we would start by allowing each individual student to come up with an answer for this question. Remember our research on wait time, so don't rush it. After you gave students time to think, now tell them it's time to pair. So I would announce that, and they would now understand it's time to talk together. So this assumes that the teacher has already instructed students as to how this works. Especially if they're younger students, you would need to possibly share this with them. So they've had time to think, now they pair, and they're going to compare their answers and come up with a more definitive response that they think will be the best response. And finally, we would allow time to share. And again, it could be every group sharing, it could be select group sharing, you could randomly call on groups, you could ask for groups to volunteer if they feel that they were right on task. Ideally, just like with answering questions, don't point out before you start the activity that, oh, now it's time for group, this particular group and that particular group to share at the end. Put everybody on the accountability piece, make everybody accountable, think, pair, and then announce how you're going to have them share. So that's how we could use it in our classroom. Having considered learning in pairs, now let's turn our focus on learning in small groups, also known as cooperative learning groups. Cooperative learning groups are heterogeneous groups who work together with the emphasis on supporting one another. So this is based on the work primarily of Lev Vygotsky. And Vygotsky argues that learning is most effective when learners are cooperating, working together in a supportive learning environment under the guidance of a teacher. The theory that supports this is that when you get a heterogeneous group of learners and you give them a common task, so they're all working together towards a common goal, a bunch of things happen that are very positive. Their friendship increases. Their respect for each other and each other's viewpoint tends to increase. Individual self-esteem is increased. Higher order thinking is increased. And learning is increased as well. A cooperative learning group typically has more than 2 students, so typically between 3 and 8 students. Now, a lot of teachers don't go as high as 8 students. Many times 3 to 5 students is quite sufficient. We already stated that for cooperative learning groups to work best, it's best to use a heterogeneous mix of students. So when you're grouping students, when you're selecting students to participate in individual groups, think about diversity along these lines. Think about personality type. You could have the more assertive and the less assertive students working together. Think about changing the social pattern. Instead of all friends working together, break them up and place them in different groups. Let them meet new people and get to experience working with other people who they're not necessarily direct friends with. Consider their diversity in terms of the interest level in the content area or in that particular topic. Consider learning style and vary according to different learning styles, and also diversity in terms of the ability of each of the students. For these learning groups to work effectively, especially should you choose to work on the higher end of 6 to 8 students per group, a teacher should assign 2 tasks to each group member. Number 1, of course, they have to perform their particular assigned task. And the second task is to monitor to make sure that others are also performing their tasks. So in other words, each group should learn to police itself, so to speak. In this process, you're going to be fostering interpersonal skills and skills that they'll need when they're in the world of work. And also ensure that all students understand the roles that they're in, whatever you decide those roles are for that particular task, and then rotate roles as well, so that students can move through the different roles and experience them. When a teacher implements a diverse group of learners functioning in cooperative learning groups, they normally realize a number of benefits. First, improved communication among the students, more acceptance of differences among each other, fewer off-task behaviors, typically happen. So classroom management becomes a little easier when using these groups. Thinking strategies improve because you've got a diversity of students with different approaches. And also learning, academic achievement go higher. So how does a teacher grade the outcome of the cooperative learning groups? Well, grading can be a little more complex. Realize that it's not the only grade in that content on that particular topic that the students are going to receive. So while they're in the groups, grade based on the group achievement. So what does the whole team achieve? Now, some options that you could implement as well. You can recognize individual contributions if somebody is a standout and working very hard, contributing to that group. You can allow for that in your grading system. And also, depending on the ability of different members of that group, you could take that in consideration and build that into your grading system as well. So while the whole group can receive a grade for these activities that the group performs, realize that individual learners will be assessed again later because you'll have a test, there might be a paper, there might be some other homework assignments based on this. So this is not the end-all and be-all in terms of grading. So consider grading the group and its achievement. Now, we've all participated at some point in our educational career, either 7 through 12, or in the college world, we've all participated in some type of group activities in the classroom. And we all know that in all groups, certain students are going to really want to shine, they're going to assume a lot of responsibility, and maybe too much responsibility. And at the other end, we also have students who are reluctant to contribute and just kind of laying back and not contributing a whole lot. So one way around that, or to address it at least, many teachers find that they assign particular roles. In other words, if they provide a little more structure and guidance to the groups, that's a more effective way to structure what's going to happen and avoids some of the problems of either too much or too little contribution. So let's take a look at the assigning of roles. Assigning roles helps the learners who are participating in the group to understand what the different activities are, what the accountability is, like what needs to be accomplished. And it also helps to ensure the accountability for all students to participate because each student will have a particular job, so to speak, in this process. Now, if you allow students then to rotate through those roles as you give the group additional activities later, then they get to practice different roles, and thus they get to have the opportunity to develop a variety of social skills and problem-solving skills, how to work together, and how to make these groups more effective in the future. So start by considering what kinds of roles would support the type of task that you're looking to do. Now, it could be the individual task. More likely, it's going to be the way that you approach tasks according to your content area. Some common roles that many teachers will use are a facilitator, a person who kind of leads and kind of takes charge of the group, a recorder, a presenter, a timekeeper. Some other roles that are sometimes used are a fact checker, someone who does the summarizing, maybe an artist, an audio-visual, a multimedia person, like a resource gathering person, a vocabulary person. So determine what roles are needed for the task for your group. Then provide clear expectations for each role. And finally, debrief with the students later to evaluate these roles. Like what worked, what didn't, and then modify the process as needed for the future. As already stated, once you determine the roles that you're going to need for the groups, then provide guidance and understanding as to what each person is supposed to do. So the facilitator kind of leads the group, keeps the group on task. Maybe you'll need a materials manager, someone who will obtain and maintain and put away the materials. A recorder is always a good idea, someone who's going to keep track of what the group is doing and everything that they're, the processes that they're using. A reporter, someone who's going to report out to the teacher, a person who's going to speak aloud later, is always a good one. A thinking monitor is an interesting role. This would be an individual who would identify and record the process. So in other words, what did we think on the outset? What are we doing? And so it's like an overall monitor of the thinking and of the processing of the group. Now, not everyone is going to enjoy being in one of those particular roles. So be sure to rotate students through all of the positions as you give the groups different tasks. One specific type of cooperative learning group that is effectively used in literature in particular is called reciprocal teaching. In reciprocal teaching, typically the teacher will assign students to groups of 4 people, and very specifically 4 people, because then there are 4 specific jobs or roles for the students to do. So in literature class, students are reading a passage of text, and then they're assigned to stop at a certain point. Everybody takes notes, and then the class will break into groups, and in each group you'll have these 4 roles. You'll have one person who's going to focus on summarizing or highlighting the key ideas. One person is going to focus on questioning. So what things were unclear, or what was puzzling, or maybe looking at the motivation of characters or connections to things already learned. And that person will simply pose some questions. A third student will function as the clarifier, and this person will address confusing parts and will attempt to focus on those questions that the questioner has posed and attempt to respond to them. And finally, the predictor is going to focus solely on, well, what's going to happen next? What do we think is the very next step here? How is this going to turn out? So for literature teachers, maybe you've already experienced reciprocal teaching. If not, consider using this in some of your classes. To wrap up today's online class and to further process this material, let's practice preparing to implement cooperative learning groups in the classroom. So not dyads, not think, pair, share, but let's work with groups of between 3 and 8 students. So working with teachers of the same content, start by considering what topic is your class discussing. Then on our wiki, specify what is the task that you're going to ask the students to focus on. Is there a problem to solve? Is there a question to respond to? Is there some issue that you want them to address in some way? Specify what that is. Because as you can tell, that the more specific you are with your instructions to the students, the better quality results are going to be yielded from this. Then determine how many students is it appropriate to have in each group. Again, you're going to be working now with a group of students as you do this, a group of other teaching candidates. So you may differ in your ideas, but let's determine or specify a number of students that are appropriate for this particular task. Then identify how are you going to create a diversified group of students, a heterogeneous group. Are you going to consider student ability, learning style, their personality, social patterns? How are you going to group those students? And finally, identify what student roles that will be appropriate for this particular task. So give it a try and see how you would prepare for the implementation of a cooperative learning group activity in your classroom. Have a great day, and I'll see you at our next class.